No kid's Jewish education should end at 13. Adjerba offers Ontario high school credits infused with Jewish learning online for teens across the province. Ministry approved, intellectually demanding, Jewishly transformative. Adjerba.ca. Your teen belongs here.
Hi everyone, I'm Ellin, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Wednesday, January 14th, 2026. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Today, we're bringing you a conversation that my colleague, the CJN's opinion editor Phoebe Maltz Bovy, had with a new and influential Canadian voice on the combating anti-Semitism scene. He's Adam Louis-Klein. He founded the Movement Against Antizionism, and he spells anti-Zionism without the hyphen deliberately, and he'll tell you why. He's a writer and an academic, currently completing his PhD in anthropology at McGill University. He created his activist organization to help Zionists prepare responses to public anti-Zionist claims and to try to reframe the discussion entirely. He explains it all in this conversation with Phoebe. Enjoy. We'll be back Friday.
I think you could probably go further and say that one of the reasons so-called Zionism exists today, or that people even might feel the need to say, I'm a Zionist in the sense that I support the existence of Israel, is because there's a movement trying to annihilate Israel. So I think even at that level, Zionism is sort of dependent on anti-Zionism.
I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy. You're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. Every conversation about Israel and Jews seems to land on the same trite, throat-clearing aside. Anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. This comes up whenever someone announces that they hate Zionists, but not Jews. It also comes up whenever someone Jewish wishes to speak out against anti-Jewish hatred, but fears being seen as doing so in order to make a pro-Israel point. Anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. This is inescapable as a refrain. But is there anything to it? I'm delighted to have on Adam Louis-Klein. Adam is a PhD student in anthropology at McGill, the founder of the Movement Against Antizionism, and everywhere these days he's a genuine public intellectual. Exciting to have one on. Adam, welcome to The Jewish Angle.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So my first question was going to be, what is anti-Zionism? But then something popped up in the news where I realized that there was like kind of more concrete way to go about asking the same thing. So there was a news story in JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, about some workers at Bread's Bakery, an Israeli in theme and Israeli as in individuals-owned bakery chain in New York City. And these workers are organizing both for better working conditions along the usual lines, but also because they object to such things as this bakery participating in a Jewish food festival that has some sort of touch something, that touch something, that touch something, that touch a Zionist kind of, that sort of thing. Anyway, so would that sort of story, and I ask knowing you're not necessarily up on that particular story, is that the sort of thing you mean by anti-Zionism?
That's exactly what we mean by anti-Zionism. So anti-Zionism is a kind of hatred of Israelis and of Jews who are marked as so-called Zionists. Now, one of the big miscomprehensions that exists in much of the public discourse about anti-Zionism is there's a belief that it's a kind of neutral political opinion about Zionism, whatever that would mean, or about Israeli policy. But actually, anti-Zionism, just as it's become standard to write anti-Semitism without a hyphen, because we don't believe that anti-Semitism is a kind of rational discourse about something called Semitism, we also think that anti-Zionism should be written without a hyphen. So anti-Zionism is not a neutral view about so-called Zionism, which was a national liberation movement for the Jewish people that existed in the first half of the 20th century attained its goals with the creation of Israel, was completely unremarkable at the time. There were tons of national groups who were seeking their own states. Anti-Zionism really constructs this figure called the Zionist, the evil Zionist. So it's really a kind of character that the anti-Zionist constructs. And of course, it's in a kind of brute and simple way, a sort of anti-Israeli racism. There's a kind of bigotry towards Israelis, towards Israeli culture. Israelis are accused of stealing food, right? You see this a lot, that Israelis stole hummus from Palestinians, when of course the reason people eat hummus in Israel is because much of the population of Israel came from Arab countries and actually just shared that local food with Arab peoples and brought that to Israel, of course. So we see a kind of overarching hatred of Israel, and it works through spreading libels, right? So today, one of the main libels of anti-Zionism is the genocide libel. Of course, they've been spreading the genocide libel for decades. Right? The Soviet Union charged Israel with genocide in the 70s, and you can go back even further. There are Arab accusations of genocide against Israel, but of course, since October 7th, the genocide libel has become, hegemonic. It's almost mainstream. It's treated as legitimate. And this functions to stigmatize Jews and Israelis who are called genocidal, complicit in genocide. So
And that comes up with that comes up in the Bread's Bakery union statement about that Bread's Bakery is somehow supposedly involved with genocide as versus with selling upscale pastries in New York, which is what it actually, and they're nice. So I think I have a pretty good idea of what the movement against anti-Zionism is about. But I wanted to ask kind of what is it, like what it's against, but what is it for? Is there something that it's for? Because I guess like my question is, it doesn't seem to be that it's like a pro-Israel movement. It's something else.
right, we want to get outside of this whole space of pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. So we actually believe that anti-Zionism harms Jews, Israelis, and Palestinians. Right? So anti-Zionism drives endless wars against Israel. It drives extremism. It marginalizes moderate Palestinian voices. We see this again and again. It's often used by governments in the Middle East to displace responsibility for their own failures, for their own social problems. It's used as a almost kind of cult or substitute for religious identity and cultural identity amongst Muslims. Often is the so-called Palestinian cause, which does not mean necessarily helping Palestinians. It means annihilating Israel, usually by mass violence. So we don't think this is about so-called defending Israeli policies, but it is about recognizing that anti-Zionism is a global hate movement against Israel, and it is based on spreading libels. So it's based on spreading malicious claims that are usually distorted, might have some partial truths, but are basically, there's an extraction of raw material from the conflict, and that's turned into a kind of inflammatory accusation against Israel that's then used to stigmatize anyone that's associated with Israel and to legitimize ongoing wars against Israel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something I was wondering about though. So I was wondering if there's something to be said strategically for Jews calling ourselves Zionists. And I ask because this is something I struggle with. Because on the one hand, I believe in Jewish self-determination and the continued existence of Israel as a Jewish state. On the other, my own understanding of Zionism is, as you say, a movement to create a state that now exists. So there's something anachronistic about it. I'm talking about kind of strategy, and if you say I am an anti-Zionist versus saying I'm a Zionist.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think today most of the iterations of the term Zionist are by anti-Zionists, and they've constructed the Zionist as an evil character. They use Zionist as a slur, right? And I think you could probably go further and say that one of the reasons so-called Zionism exists today, or that people even might feel the need to say, I'm a Zionist in the sense that I support the existence of Israel, is because there's a movement trying to annihilate Israel. So I think even at that level, Zionism is sort of dependent on anti-Zionism rather than the opposite. And that goes back to the hyphen thing again, right? When we say anti-Zionism with a hyphen, it's like, well, first there's Zionism and then there's the people opposing it, right? But what you actually have at this point, when you recognize that at some level Zionism is over and done with, right, is that anti-Zionism comes first. It constructs the evil Zionist and then also forces Jews into a kind of defensive or defiant position of saying, well, actually, I support Zionism, right? I'm a Zionist. So I think there are different opinions on this. Some people might want to say I'm a Zionist. It's like it's kind of defiant almost. It's almost like a black person, using the N word at this point, defiantly appropriating that slur. Right. And then there are others who might want to say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't even identify as Zionist, right? It gives us a sharper edge to say, Zionism is basically something that's made up at this point. And
Hmm.
anti-Zionists are just kind of on their own rocker, right? So
It's interesting. I mean, it's a reframing. It's interesting. But I have a
that's-
practical question though, inspired by the "What We Do" section of the Movement Against Antizionism website. So what you described there sounds similar to something like DEI consulting or something like this. And I'm kind of struggling with how to phrase this because there's no shortage of people and institutions that I would happily, if I had my druthers, subject to that sort of training. But I'm having trouble picturing any of them voluntarily signing up for it. Like the people who need to hear this, are those the people hearing it? Like, I guess I'm just wondering, kind of like pragmatically, like, is there demand for training in learning about anti-Zionism as a hate movement? Is your organization going in places and like doing trainings?
yeah, we do tons of trainings. So we basically help people learn how to speak back against anti-Zionism. So what do you do, right? It happens a lot online these days, right? Like, what do you do if you're being harassed by an anti-Zionist, right? If someone comes on to your post because it's about whatever, maybe you showed some support for Israeli women who were raped in October 7th, and someone comes on your post and says there were no rapes, Hannibal directive, you're a genocidal baby killer, right? How do you respond? And right now we have no, the communal infrastructure has not given us a lot of tactics, right? We can say it's anti-Semitic, right? And they'll say anti-Zionism is an anti-Semitism. Zionists cry anti-Semitism, but they're actually genocidal, right? And then we have nothing left because all we've really developed is we've just learned how to say it's anti-Semitic, and we've hoped that saying it's anti-Semitic will be enough. And unfortunately, we've seen that it hasn't been. That anti-Zionism is slipping through, and it's
Hmm.
partially because anti-Zionism is its own hate movement. So when someone came on your wall and was saying that stuff, they say you're a genocidal white colonizer. Actually, those aren't traditionally anti-Semitic libels. They're anti-Zionist libels. They're their own
Hmm.
tropes.
I guess what I'm just wondering, if this makes sense, is so is the training you're doing more in kind of instructing Jews on how to push back and less like, I guess I'm wondering, are there any like non-Jewish entities saying as many the equivalent of the kind of 2020, how do we make it clear that we think Black Lives Matter at our workplace, some kind of equivalent? Like, are there non-Jewish employers worried about the anti-Zionism going around, you
That's
know?
what we're trying to change. I mean, we need
Hmm.
more a cultural shift for that to happen because there's too many people in the broader public, right, who only recognize classical anti-Semitism, and we also need more institutional support at this point from organizations who will pivot to recognizing anti-Zionism as its own hatred and bigotry. A big issue is that the frameworks that are being used right now that were effective in some ways or have been effective sometimes, but they're not exactly working right now, are the ones that are all about cross the line discourse, right? When does anti Zionism cross the line into anti Semitism, which we think is incoherent and is actually obscuring anti Zionism? Because what it's really saying is, when does anti Zionism start looking like classical anti Semitism? So, when does an anti Zionist, who might be a smart left academic style leftist, who's harassing and bullying you by calling you an evil white colonizer, right? When does that person reveal themselves and cross the line to be actually a kind of skinhead, right? Who says that,
Hmm.
are racially infiltrating their nation and bringing in immigrants, right? But that is kind of incoherent. right? Because anti-Zionism isn't necessarily going to reveal itself as classical anti-Semitism, of right-wing European-style anti-Semitism that's recognizable as anti-Semitism, that's associated with that word anti-Semitism, right? It's actually its own hatred.
What do you say to someone who's neither Jewish nor Palestinian, who has no personal or familial connection to the conflict, who has just spent the last couple of years hearing nonstop about horrific conditions and unthinkable death tolls in Gaza, and who, by their definition, Zionism is the movement to keep Israel Jewish, and they look at all these deaths and they're sad, and the thing that they blame is Zionism. What do you say to somebody like this? There are one or two such people in Toronto.
Well, first of all, anti-Zionism, right, is the causal source of the wars against Israel. I mean, we don't have to litigate it right now, but there are endless attempts to annihilate Israel, whether that was in 1948,
You're
1967.
assuming a person who thinks Israel should exist. True of me, not of the person I'm talking about.
Okay, so then this is not really a
Yeah.
neutral person. You're talking about a full-on believing anti-Zionist.
Yeah, I'm talking about somebody who was not plugged into this issue at all, who suddenly sees all the stuff that seems very sad in the news, and they were like dropped here effectively in 2023. They don't know about much that happened before that.
Yeah, I mean, so what we've seen is circuits of disinformation, and like I was saying before, systemic libel. So anti-Zionist libel is its own kind of practice. It's the circulation of kind of unfalsifiable claims in the sense that people don't feel the need to demonstrate them. The point is you just kind of believe them because they construct this a group as evil. So these are kind of race libels.
Mhm.
We basically saw a constant circulation of anti-Zionist libels since October 7th, and we saw the mainstreaming of a narrative of genocide and that already existed.
Right. Well, that already existed part I wanted to talk a little bit about because I think um, there was obviously like talk about blood libel, things like this. These, very old accusations of Jews killing non-Jewish children. There
Hmm.
is also the actual war, you know,
Hmm.
where this is not, and like I guess what I'm saying is like, how do you explain to the people who are looking at the facts from which the libels come, but are distorted, that it's libel? You know what I mean?
Well,
Does that
so
make
first of all,
sense?
we have to recognize that the actual discourse around the conflict and the war in Gaza completely broke down. So I would go as far as to say there has been very little rational discourse about what actually occurred in Gaza, because there were some people who were looking at the facts of what was going on in Gaza with military expertise, with knowledge of conditions on the ground, etc. And there was just a huge mass of voices, a kind of herd, a kind of mob movement that was being propelled forward by yellow journalism, by journalistic malpractice, where they would immediately circulate claims coming out of Gaza without any verification of these claims, such as the Al Ali bombing, right? So very early in the conflicts, right, there was a claim that Israel had bombed a hospital deliberately and killed 500 people, right? Various agencies looked into it. They basically found actually this hospital was hit by a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket. The casualty counts were tragic, but far, far lower, something like 50. It did not even land on the hospital. It landed in the parking lot near the hospital, right? So there have been so many libels like that, like this throughout the conflict. I have a whole actually document of them on my computer, right? That one cannot even count. So then you have to ask yourself, why is it that this repeatedly happens, right? Why is it that a newspaper releases a story, right? Everyone goes into a frenzy about how evil it is, right? And then they quietly retract the story, right? Or other people even learn that it was false, but then the next time they do the exact same thing. And that's really the giveaway, right? Because if you can't adjust your credibility assessments based on past instances, right, of being non-credible, that shows it's not a rational engagement with information, right? So
Hmm.
it's just a kind of pre-existing desire to believe, a prejudice, really, that grounds belief in these libels. So we basically experienced a kind of disinformation stream that was constant out of Gaza since October 7th, right? And so that's really what matters right now in the public conversation, in the way that Gaza and the Gaza so-called genocide has been framed, right? One could have a conversation about what actually happened, right? But it's almost meaningless at this point.
I wanted to ask about Mamdani, Zoran Mamdani. I'm sure you're familiar. I'm sure he's sitting with you right now. Just kidding. So anti-Zionism is in many ways, one might say, his central cause, but he's also, this is the new mayor of New York, he's also embracing a broader progressive agenda that appeals to many, including many younger New York Jews, although on the whole, Jews did not vote for him. So my question is kind of one of two things. You can answer it one of two ways. Should you choose? One is sort of just what do you make of Mamdani generally, but also just more broadly, what do you do with the way that anti-Zionism has been woven into the general idea of what it means to be a kind, heart in the right place, progressive, or even just sort of citizen? Like, it's just if you care, if you have a bleeding heart, your heart bleeds for all the sad things, and part of that is anti-Zionism. You know what I mean? Like it's woven into something. You know what I mean?
I exactly know what you mean. It's become kind of this lingua franca of the present. Basically, different people use hatred of Israel to kind of articulate their politics and pose as righteous. And now Jew hatred is often posed as righteous in other eras as well, because what happens is you construct the Jew according to the inverse of the moral values of the time, right? So since World War II, the Holocaust, since civil rights movement, since decolonization, right? So the great values of our civilization today are basically opposition to racism, colonialism, and genocide, right? And Israel has been constructed as racist, colonial, and genocidal, the colonizer, apartheid, and genocide libels, right? So you tell anyone, right? There's a state that's a white colonial, racist, genocidal state. Pretty much everyone today shares those values. I'd say even people on the right sort of have internalized the values that is what evil is, right? So if you tell anyone that, it just kind of fits so smoothly into the grooves of kind of our moral intuitions that you don't need to know anything about Israel. It instantly makes sense, and you are sort of almost instantly angry. You almost have this righteous anger, right? Like, I'm against racism. If someone told me there was a place where there were these horrendous racists who were doing these horrendous things, I'd just start feeling angry about it. And so that's how it creates this righteous anger. But of course, anti-Zionism is not bleeding heart. It's a hate movement. We see every single day on Twitter, there are thousands of accounts just talking about how much they hate Israel, how much they hate Netanyahu, saying horrendous things about Israelis, dehumanizing people, calling for violence. This is a hate movement, right?
Well,
And so,
hating Netanyahu, I mean, I feel like that could just be hating a politician, which
but
unless it's the only
but they
politician
hate,
you
but no, but
yes.
they hate him. Like they have a irrational
Yeah.
hatred for him. I'm
Something
not,
I've noticed on Blue
not
Sky
sure.
is that people seem to hate Barry Weiss more than they hate Trump, which I find
Yeah, of
perhaps
course, and
worthy of unpacking. But anyway,
the
just yeah.
Barry Weiss hate movement is like more. I'd say it's a more of a classical anti-Semitic hate movement, right? It's a sense of there's a Jewish woman who's succeeding in society, and Jews as an ethnic minority should not succeed, right? They should be kind of subjugated within our society. So there's more of a traditional anti-Semitism that Barry Weiss is subject to in that case, but of course also the fact that she is not an anti-Zionist.
Right.
Uh,
And you've written for the Free Press, and we will a really interesting article that we will link to in the show notes. So I have two more questions for you. One is kind of like very specific, and the other is more general. So the specific one is I know that one of your areas of focus is Jews as an indigenous people, and that this relates to your academic research. And I was wondering whether Albert Memmi has come up at all in your work. I asked just because I remember reading him in grad school myself and thinking how strange it was that Zionism was not understood just kind of widely as a sort of decolonizing or post-colonial type movement.
Right. I've read him. I haven't read him like super deeply, and it's been a little bit. But if I remember correctly, one thing he said that I think was kind of unusual and insightful. Right. He was someone who was on the left. He was someone who kind of was opposed to so-called colonialism, European colonialism, I believe in Algeria. Right. So
I mean, yeah. I mean, he was, I believe, Tunisian, but yeah,
yeah, he was
yeah,
Tunisian. But he talked about kind of
hmm
French
yeah,
settler colonialism in Algeria. And he talked about also how the Jews were sort of constructed as these alien Europeans and as kind of proxy colonists. And so that's something you see throughout the Middle East, and it expresses kind of a deep irony, right? So Mizrahim, Jews from the Middle East, had actually lived in that area. The way I understand indigeneity, I would not call them indigenous to those regions, but they had lived in that area since before Islam had arrived. Right, so Muslims or Islam, let's say, had conquered those regions, and now these Arab nationalist states were constructing themselves as the natives against Jews who were now being cast as foreigners. So Memi was someone who was opposing European colonialism, but also recognizing how casting Jews as European colonists was itself a kind of nefarious and inaccurate
hmm
act that he was opposing. So I'm very sympathetic to kind of how he framed that,
You
right?
should
So
read his later. He wrote some later books where it's like all about Jewish stuff and like kind of reclaiming all of this sort of for Jews. It's interesting. I have not read this in like 15 years or something, but it's super interesting. But I also wanted to just, as I sort of delve into this sort of past life, I wanted to ask a little bit. Just my last question is about academia, right? And as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I did a PhD in French. I have pretty reasonably high exposure to the world of academia. And it was like, I was basically, it was as if I was Netanyahu being like liberal Zionist, or whatever you want to call it, politics. And I want to quote something that you wrote in the Free Press. You wrote, "When I proposed hosting a single academic talk at my university, McGill, on the anti-Semitic genealogies of anti-Zionism, particularly on the Soviet roots of so much of today's anti-Israel sloganeering, amid at least 10 events in my department on the so-called Gaza genocide, my request was denied without explanation." End quote. So I bring this up obviously partly because this is a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News, Canada, Canadian connection here. But I was wondering whether you see a future for yourself within academia and also just sort of more broadly for Jewish scholars who are not uh, anti-Zionists.
yeah, I mean, so I may as well just be public about this at this point. I mean, me having a career in anthropology right now is kind of a laughable concept. I mean, so anthropology is deeply compromised by anti-Zionism, right? They almost reorganized the entire discipline around the genocide libel. The AAA's, the American Anthropological Association Grand Conference 2024 was entirely so-called about the Gaza genocide, not as something to debate, but as a premise. They have completely swallowed whole the settler colonial framing of Israel, which erases Jewish indigeneity, which is really a form of cultural erasure. It's a form of racism that constructs a group as sort of biologically alien to the land by descent. And I've written about this, but it's a kind of genocidal ideology in itself, and it's that through which kind of nativist fascist movements like Hamas legitimized the genocide of October 7th. So I don't have a lot of nice things to say about the state of the discipline of anthropology today. And it's very sad because anthropology should be in a position to come to a nuanced understanding of the cultural identity of Jews, right? And it should use its basic ethical framework, which is that it listens to the people it engages with. It takes seriously the way people understand their own self-identity and their history. And the notion that Jews made up that there are people in the 19th century and don't actually come from Israel is sort of just bland bigotry, right? And ignorance, because anyone who is Jewish, the vast majority of Jews, understand that Jews are a people and that our sort of self-conception is bound up with a kind of much longer history in which we came out of Egypt, went to the land of Israel, were exiled, first to Babylon, then we came back, then we're exiled again, and then came home. And of course, one can say this is a mythic story or it has historical elements. It's also mythic. But in anthropology, we actually don't think like that, right? When we look at other groups, we don't say, well, your whole history's fake. Right? We actually acknowledge that even the mythic dimensions are part of the kind of symbolic complex through which a people constitutes their identity. So my anthropological work, I try and restore what I think is an authentic anthropological understanding of Jews in comparison with the indigenous people that I work with and ethnographic accounts of indigenous people. In terms of academia generally, there might be other spaces, and I hope that the critical study of anti-Zionism will be able to take root somewhere in academia, and so we can have a presence there.
Adam, thank you so much for coming on The Jewish Angle. This has been so interesting.
Yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.